The letter arrived on a Tuesday, the same day the garbage is collected. I remember the sound of the truck's hydraulics groaning down the street as I slit the envelope. It was thick paper, the kind of paper that feels like it has a trust fund. Cream-colored, with an embossed letterhead, Creekwood Estates Homeowners Association. The name itself was a lie. There was no creek, and these were hardly estates. They were just oversized houses packed too close together, monuments to cheap materials and leveraged debt. My place was different. It was the original farmhouse, the one the developer had built his suburban kingdom around. I had 10 acres, a buffer of green pasture and old oaks that kept the sea of beige stucco at bay. It was my fortress of solitude. My wife Eleanor and I had bought it 30 years ago, a promise we made to ourselves that we'd have a place where the sky was bigger than the roof. After she was gone, it became more than a promise. It became a sanctuary, a living memorial. The letter was written in a florid, looping font, the kind of script that tries too hard to look elegant. It informed me, it did not ask, that the HOA Beautification Committee had approved the rerouting of the community nature trail. The new path, it stated, would cut across the northern edge of my pasture, connecting the cul-de-sac on Winchester Lane with the new playground on the other side. It cited a previously unused utility easement and concluded with a cheerful, "Construction to commence on the 1st of next month. We thank you for your cooperation in making Creekwood Estates an even more desirable place to live." I read it twice, then a third time. My vision narrowed until the only things in focus were the words, "Your cooperation." It wasn't a request. It was a royal decree, and I knew exactly who the queen was. Brenda Collins, HOA president for life, or at least for as long as her husband's commercial real estate money kept flowing. She was a woman engineered for command in a world the size of a teacup. Her face was a smooth, unmoving mask of Botox and fillers. Her hair a helmet of blonde so chemically processed, it probably had its own EPA warning label. She drove a white Escalade the size of a small gunboat and patrolled the neighborhood like a U-boat commander, searching for violations. A slightly overgrown lawn, a garbage can left out an hour too long, a basketball hoop that wasn't the approved shade of beige. These were high crimes in Brenda's little fiefdom. She smelled of expensive, industrial-strength perfume, a chemical sweetness that clung to the air long after her Escalade had purred away. You could smell her before you saw her. Her voice was a low, condescending purr when she was in control, and a shrill, glass-shattering shriek when she was challenged. I'd seen her reduce a new homeowner to tears over the color of their welcome mat. The man was a retired Marine colonel. It was a terrifying spectacle. My world smelled of different things, WD-40 and sawdust from my workshop, pine sap from the trees Eleanor and I planted, rich, black coffee brewed strong enough to dissolve a spoon. I was a retired logistics manager. For 40 years, my entire professional life was about making sure millions of tons of goods, materials, and equipment moved from point A to point B with maximum efficiency and minimal fuss. I managed complex supply chains that spanned continents. I dealt with port strikes, hurricanes, customs officials, and transportation unions. My job was to analyze complex systems, identify failure points, and create elegant, unbreakable solutions. I was, by nature and by trade, a patient, methodical man. I had zero patience left for entitled bullies. Brenda had made a critical error in her calculations. It was a systems failure cascade, and she hadn't even realized the first domino had tipped. She saw an old man, a widower living alone in a house that was too big for him. She saw a quiet neighbor who kept to himself. She underestimated me. That was her first mistake. It would not be her last. I didn't storm over to her house. I didn't fire off an angry email. My initial rage was a white-hot flash, but it quickly cooled into something else. Something colder, heavier, and far more dangerous. It was the quiet, methodical fury of an engineer who has just discovered a fatal design flaw in a critical system. The emotion was there, but it was immediately channeled into process, analysis, data collection. I went into my study, the room that had once been Eleanor's office. Her scent was still faintly there, a ghost of lavender and old books. It calmed me. It focused me. On the wall was a large, framed satellite map of our property and the surrounding development. A gift from my old company upon my retirement. I took it down and laid it on the large drafting table I used for my woodworking projects. Using a set of architectural rulers, I carefully drew the path of the proposed trail as described in the letter. It cut a clean, arrogant line right through the gentlest slope of the pasture, the very spot where Eleanor and I had talked about putting a bench one day. It would be 100 yards of trampled grass, chattering neighbors, and their yapping dogs right under my nose. A permanent violation. The letter mentioned a utility easement. That was the linchpin of her plan, the legal justification. So that was my first objective. I spent the rest of that afternoon in the county records office, a place that smelled of dust and decaying paper. The clerk was a young woman with purple hair who looked bored out of her mind. She pointed me to a terminal, and I dove into the digital archives. It took me 2 hours of navigating an arcane filing system, but I found it. The original plat map for the Creekwood Estates development. And there it was, a 10-foot-wide utility easement, clearly marked, running along the northernmost edge of my property line. It was intended for water and sewer lines that were never built. Legally, she had a right of access, a flimsy one, but it was there. Any normal person would see this as a setback. I saw it as the first data point. I printed every relevant document, the plat map, the easement filing, the articles of incorporation for the HOA. The paper was thin and cheap, a stark contrast to Brenda's creamy letterhead. I paid the clerk in cash and walked out with a folder that was already an inch thick. This was the beginning of the project file. Back in my study, I opened a new notebook, a black, hardcover ledger, the kind accountants used before everything went digital. On the first page, I wrote in neat block letters, Project Nightingale. Eleanor had loved the sound of the birds that sang in the pasture at dusk. The name felt right. I began my documentation. The first entry was a scan of Brenda's letter, followed by copies of the county records. I logged the date, the time, and a summary of the findings. From that moment on, every interaction, every piece of mail, every observation would be entered into the log with the detached precision of a lab technician. Emotion was a variable that could corrupt the data. I would not allow it. The next day, the escalation began, just as my projections had indicated it would. A survey crew arrived. 2 young men in bright orange vests, hammering stakes into my pasture. They were just doing their job, so I was polite. I brought them out a thermos of coffee and a plate of donuts. While they worked, I asked them casual questions about their work order. They confirmed it was contracted by the HOA. I took detailed photographs of them, their truck, the stakes, making sure the timestamp on my camera was activated. Each photo was downloaded, printed, and entered into the log. Project Nightingale was acquiring assets. Brenda must have seen me from her window, or one of her neighborhood spies reported in. An hour later, her white Escalade pulled up to my driveway, blocking it completely. She didn't get out. She laid on the horn, a long, obnoxious blast that sent the birds scattering from the feeders. I finished watering Eleanor's roses before I walked slowly over to her window. She powered it down with a soft whir. The wave of her perfume hit me first. "Frank, darling," she purred, her lips barely moving. She was wearing oversized sunglasses that hid half of her face. "I see you've met the survey team. So exciting, isn't it?" I leaned against my fence post, deliberately staying on my side of the property line. "Brenda, your car is blocking my driveway." Her smile was a thin, bloodless line. "Just wanted to make sure you got the letter and that we're all on the same page. We're moving forward with this. It's going to raise property values for everyone." "It's going to cut through my pasture," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "It's on the easement, Frank. Perfectly legal. Our lawyers have checked," she said, the purr in her voice sharpening just a little. "You can't stand in the way of progress. Don't be that old man. It's a bad look." I just looked at her. I let the silence hang in the air. I've found that people like Brenda are terrified of silence. They need to fill it with noise, with their own importance. She shifted in her leather seat. "Look, honey, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. The trail is happening. If you cooperate, it'll be pleasant. If you make a fuss—" She let the threat dangle, then gestured vaguely with a hand weighed down by a diamond the size of a pigeon's egg. "Fines, liens, legal fees. The HOA has a very, very deep litigation budget. You don't." I pushed myself off the fence post. "You're still blocking my driveway," I said. I turned and walked back to my house without another word. In my rear view, I could see her perfectly still for a moment, and I absolutely knew, that under those sunglasses her eyes were slits of pure fury. The quiet dismissal was a far greater insult to her than a shouting match would have been. I heard her tires squeal as she peeled out. Inside, I immediately went to my study. I opened the logbook. 10:17 a.m., direct contact with B. Collins. Subject initiated contact. Verbal threats issued fines, liens, legal action. Tone: condescending, hostile. Recorded conversation via lapel microphone. I popped the tiny digital recorder out of my shirt pocket, downloaded the audio file, and backed it up to 3 separate hard drives. The data was accumulating. The system was revealing its weaknesses. Over the next 2 weeks, the harassment ramped up. I received 3 official violation notices from the HOA. One was for a patch of moss on my north-facing roof shingles. It had been there for 20 years. Another was for the unapproved color of the trim on my workshop, which was a faded barn red. The third, and this was my favorite, was for unaesthetic placement of a bird bath. The fines totaled $1,500. I didn't pay them. I photographed them, scanned them, and filed them in the logbook under a new tab: extraneous, coercive actions. Brenda's strategy was a classic pincer movement. One flank was the official pseudo-legal attack via HOA violations. The other was a social and psychological assault. She started a rumor, spread through the neighborhood's Facebook group, that I was a hoarder and that my property was an eyesore that was dragging down everyone's home values. My immediate neighbors, good people I'd known for years, started avoiding my gaze. One of them, a man named George, who I used to share a beer with over the fence, shuffled his feet and apologized. "She's got the whole board in her pocket, Frank. They're all terrified of her. She got my brother-in-law's business blacklisted from the approved vendor list because his wife complimented your garden." This was another crucial data point. Her control was absolute, built on a foundation of fear and petty retribution. The board members were not her allies. They were her hostages. I made a note of George's story, dating it and attributing it. Witness testimony. All this time, the stakes were being hammered deeper into my land. The proposed trail was now a raw, ugly scar of upturned earth. They'd brought in a small bulldozer that tore through the grass Eleanor and I had so carefully cultivated. The sound of it was a grinding in my teeth, a constant, grating reminder of the invasion. Every evening, after the workers left, I would walk the path of destruction, photographing the damage. The deep ruts from the tires, the displaced soil, the roots of a young maple tree severed and exposed. Each photo was a piece of evidence. Each foot of churned-up mud was another line item in the damages column I was mentally calculating. But all of this was just noise. The fines, the rumors, the bulldozer. It was all designed to provoke an emotional, irrational response. To drag me into a fight on her terms. A battle of escalating complaints and expensive lawyers. But I wasn't fighting her battle. I was running a different operation entirely. While she was busy with her shock and awe campaign, I was in my study, night after night, running a deep dive analysis. I expanded my research. I moved beyond county property records and into state law. I downloaded and read, word for word, the entirety of the state's property code. I read agricultural law, zoning ordinances, environmental regulations. I drank coffee until my hands hummed with caffeine and the words on the screen started to blur. I was searching for a key, a single overlooked variable that would allow me to dismantle her entire system from the inside out. I knew it had to be there. In any complex system, there are always loopholes, forgotten clauses, and unintended consequences. Bureaucracies, especially petty ones like an HOA, create their own intricate traps. They wrap themselves in so many layers of rules and regulations that they inevitably create a contradiction, a knot that can't be untied. I just had to find the right thread to pull. The breakthrough came at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday. My eyes were burning from staring at the computer screen. I was deep in the state's Department of Agriculture website, reading about something called the Right to Farm Act. It was a piece of legislation designed to protect farmers from nuisance lawsuits filed by new suburban developments that encroached on existing agricultural land. It was meant for traditional farms, big operations. But as I read the definitions, my heart started to beat a little faster. The act defined a farm operation in incredibly broad terms. It included not just the cultivation of crops, but also the raising, breeding, and management of livestock. Then I cross-referenced it with the county zoning code for my specific parcel of land. My 10 acres were zoned agricultural residential. It was a legacy designation from before the development was built, a transitional zone that allowed for both a single-family residence and limited agricultural activities. That was interesting, but it wasn't the bomb. The bomb, the beautiful, exquisite, perfectly engineered munition I was looking for, was in a subclause of the HOA's own governing documents, the ones I'd printed out on that first day. I'd read them half a dozen times, but this time, with the context of the Right to Farm Act fresh in my mind, one sentence glowed like it was radioactive. It was in the section on common areas and easements. It stated, "Any easement utilized for the creation of a permanent, community-accessible pathway or trail shall be considered a public right-of-way for the purposes of liability and maintenance, and its use shall be governed by all applicable state and county statutes." I leaned back in my chair, and a slow, cold smile spread across my face. My hands were perfectly steady. The system had revealed its fatal flaw. Brenda, in her arrogant rush to ram this trail through, had used a legal shortcut. To avoid the HOA having to bear the full liability for injuries on the trail, her lawyers had inserted that clause. It designated the trail a public right-of-way. A public right-of-way running through a parcel of land zoned agricultural residential. A public right-of-way that was now, legally, abutting a potential farm operation. Under the state's Right to Farm Act, this created a beautiful, beautiful cascade of legal protections for me. It meant that any standard agricultural activities I conducted on my property were shielded from nuisance complaints. Complaints about things like noise, dust, and most importantly, odor. Brenda hadn't just rerouted a trail. She had, with her own official signature, handed me a loaded gun. She had legally created the perfect, legally protected environment for me to engage in some light farming. The planning phase of Project Nightingale began that night. My rage was gone, replaced by the pure, clean joy of a complex problem finding its elegant solution. This would not be a simple revenge. It would be a work of art, a masterpiece of logistical precision and psychological warfare. First, I needed residents. New ones. The kind of residents who would thoroughly enjoy a brand new, publicly accessible trail running right next to their home. The Right to Farm Act was broad, but I needed something with maximum impact. Cows were an option, but too placid. Goats were clever, but too small. No, this situation called for something specific, something loud, something aromatic, something porcine. Pigs. The answer was pigs. Specifically, a heritage breed, Yorkshire pigs. They are large, intelligent, and famously vocal, and their manure has a certain robust, unforgettable character. It was perfect. The number had to be right, too. Not so many as to trigger regulations for a full-scale commercial CAFO, concentrated animal feeding operation, but enough to make a statement. I settled on 40. 40 felt like a good, solid, biblical number. My old job had given me a Rolodex, a real, physical Rolodex that I still kept, full of contacts in every corner of the agricultural industry. I spent the next morning on the phone. I called a man named Stu, a hog farmer from out in the western part of the state whose shipping logistics I'd untangled a decade earlier. I explained the situation, leaving out the HOA part and framing it as a personal project, a return to my roots. Stu just chuckled. "Frank, you old dog, thought you were retired." "Semi-retired," I said. "I need 40 prime Yorkshire gilts and barrows, about 150 pounds each, healthy, loud, and ready for a new home." There was a pause on the line. "Frank, you live in a suburb now, don't you? You sure about this?" "Perfectly sure, Stu. I've got the land, and the zoning is immaculate. Just need the pigs and a transport. I'll pay top dollar." He quoted me a price. It was steep, but this was an investment in peace and quiet. I transferred the money that afternoon. The delivery was scheduled for the day of the next HOA meeting, 3 weeks away. The timing had to be perfect. Next came the infrastructure. I needed a pig pen. A sturdy, well-built, and 100% legally compliant pig pen. I spent a week designing it. It would be situated on the northern pasture, with its longest side running parallel to and exactly 5 feet from the new trail. 5 feet was the minimum legal setback required by county ordinance. I would follow every rule to the letter. I ordered the materials: T-posts, high tensile wire, insulators, a solar-powered electric fence charger strong enough to discourage a rhino, and 2 large automated feeding and watering systems. I wasn't a farmer, but I was a hell of a project manager. The delivery truck dropped a mountain of supplies in my driveway. I saw Brenda slow her Escalade as she drove by, a confused but smug look on her face. She probably thought I was building a fence to grudgingly accept the trail. She had no idea. For the next 2 weeks, I worked from dawn until dusk. I was 65, but I was in good shape. The work felt good. Driving the posts into the earth, stretching the wire until it hummed with tension, plumbing the water lines. It was physical, real. It was a stark contrast to the flimsy, paper-thin world of HOA regulations and passive-aggressive emails. I was building something tangible, a home. I constructed a simple, three-sided shelter at one end of the enclosure, and in the center, I used the small bulldozer, which the construction crew had foolishly left on site over a weekend, to dig out a large, shallow depression. This would become the wallow. With the first rain, it would fill with water and turn into a glorious mud pit. Pigs need a wallow to stay cool. It's essential for their well-being. Its placement, directly adjacent to the trail's midpoint, was a matter of both animal husbandry and strategic planning. While I worked, the trail was completed. The HOA brought in a crew to lay down fine, crushed gravel. They installed quaint little wooden signs that said Creekwood Nature Trail. They even put in 2 benches. One of them was placed in the exact spot that offered the best possible view of my new pig pen. I couldn't have planned it better myself. Brenda organized a trail opening ceremony for the Saturday before the HOA meeting. It was a grand affair. She'd rented a bouncy castle for the kids and a popcorn machine. She stood at a makeshift podium and gave a speech about community, progress, and her own tireless efforts in making Creekwood Estates the #1 planned community in the county. People applauded. They drank cheap wine from plastic cups and walked up and down the trail, congratulating each other on their new amenity. I watched from my porch, sipping my coffee. I did not participate. I just watched, and I waited. My enclosure was finished, the feeders were full, the waterers were tested, everything was ready. The stage was set. The night before the HOA meeting, I slept like a baby. I woke up before dawn. The air was cool and crisp. At 6 a.m., exactly on schedule, a large livestock transport truck rumbled down my street. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The driver, a friend of Stu's, expertly backed the long trailer down my driveway. We worked quickly and quietly. We lowered the ramp, and one by one, my 40 new residents made their way into their new home. They were magnificent. Pink, curious, and already snorting and squealing with excitement as they discovered the feeders. They were perfect. I signed the delivery manifest, shook the driver's hand, and he was gone before the first of my neighbors left for work. The rest of the day was eventful. The morning chorus began around 7:30 a.m., when the pigs discovered their breakfast was dispensed on a timer. The sound of 40 hungry, squealing pigs is not subtle. It carries. I saw curtains twitching in the houses across the street. The first dog walker to use the trail that morning stopped dead in his tracks, his retriever whining and pulling at the leash. He stared at the pigs. The pigs stared back at him. Then he practically ran back the way he came. The first official complaint was logged at 8:15 a.m. It was an email from Brenda, sent to the entire neighborhood. The subject line was just a series of frantic question marks and exclamation points. The body of the email was a sputtering, barely coherent rant about an unauthorized agricultural nuisance and a blatant violation of community standards. It promised swift and severe action. I replied to all. My response was simple. Dear Ms. Collins, I can assure you that my agricultural operation is in full compliance with all county zoning ordinances and state laws, specifically the Right to Farm Act, which is applicable here thanks to the trail's public right-of-way designation, as stipulated in our HOA bylaws, Article 7, Section 4B. I look forward to discussing this further at the meeting tonight. Sincerely, Frank Miller. The silence that followed was deafening. I imagined Brenda's perfectly manicured fingers hovering over her keyboard, her smooth face cracking like thin ice. I had just shown my hand, and I had done it using her own rulebook. The HOA meeting was held in the clubhouse, a sterile beige room that smelled faintly of chlorine from the adjacent pool. When I walked in, the room fell silent. Every eye was on me. The board members were seated at a long table at the front, with Brenda in the center, looking like a queen holding court. Her face was tight with fury. Her usual condescending smile was gone, replaced by a thin white slash. I took a seat in the back row. I had a briefcase with me. It contained the logbook, copies of every relevant document, a portable projector, and a small audio speaker. Brenda began the meeting by skipping the entire agenda. "We have an emergency situation," she announced, her voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "As many of you are aware, Mr. Miller has decided to turn his property into a pigsty, a filthy, disgusting, and illegal pig farm." A murmur went through the crowd. "This is a flagrant violation of everything Creekwood Estates stands for," she continued, her voice rising. "It is a health hazard, an attack on our property values, and an insult to this entire community. I have already been on the phone with our lawyers all day. We will be filing for an immediate injunction. We will fine him into oblivion. We will take his house. This will not stand." She pointed a trembling, acrylic-nailed finger at me. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Mr. Miller?" This was my cue. I stood up and walked calmly to the front of the room. "I do, actually," I said, my voice even. "If I may?" I didn't wait for an answer. I set up my small projector on the table and aimed it at the blank wall behind her. I clicked the remote. The first image that appeared was the plat map, with the easement clearly highlighted. "This is the utility easement you cited in your letter," I began, my voice calm and clear, like I was giving a quarterly logistics briefing. "As you can see, it is located on my property, which, according to county records," I clicked again, and the zoning document appeared, "is zoned agricultural residential." I continued, moving through my slides with methodical precision. I showed them the text from the Right to Farm Act. I showed them the specific clause from their own HOA bylaws that designated the trail a public right-of-way. I explained, in simple, clear terms, how their own actions had created the legal framework that explicitly protected my new farming operation from any nuisance complaints. So, the noise, the smell, all of it is, I'm afraid, perfectly legal. You created a public path next to a farm. You don't get to complain about the consequences of that. In fact, filing a nuisance lawsuit against a protected farm operation can result in significant financial penalties for the plaintiff. I looked directly at Brenda. That would be the HOA. That would be all of you. The room was utterly silent. The smug looks on the faces of the board members had evaporated, replaced by confusion and dawning horror. But I wasn't finished. "This was never about a trail," I said, my voice hardening slightly. "This was about greed." I clicked to the next slide. It was a copy of the Articles of Incorporation for Creekwood Trailblazers, LLC, the company the HOA had contracted to build the trail. I had found it through the state's business registry. Then I clicked again. A new document appeared next to it, a list of the LLC's officers. The president was a man named Carl Collins, Brenda's husband. A collective gasp went through the room. The contract for the trail construction was for $75,000 of HOA funds, I said, pulling the contract itself up on the screen. I had a professional surveyor and 2 independent contractors provide quotes for the same job. The highest quote was $32,000. So the question is, where did the other $43,000 of your money go? Brenda shot to her feet. This is slander. These are lies. You have no proof, she shrieked, her voice cracking. Her face was a mottled, blotchy red. The mask had shattered completely. Oh, but I do, I said calmly. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the small audio speaker. This is a recording of a phone call I made yesterday to the gravel supplier listed on the contract's invoice. I told them I was an auditor for the HOA. I pressed play. A man's voice, tinny but clear, filled the room. Yeah, Creekwood Trailblazers. We delivered 10 grand worth of gravel, but the invoice they had us write up was for 25. The other 15 they had us kick back to a separate account. Brenda Collins's personal account, I think. We do it all the time for them. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut is a very distinct sound. It's a sharp, metallic snap. And it's a sound I heard from the back of the room at that exact moment. 2 sheriff's deputies and a woman in a severe suit who introduced herself as being from the state attorney general's office had entered silently while I was speaking. Brenda's meltdown was so total she hadn't even noticed them. Her mouth hung open. A thin, keening sound escaped her lips. Her entire world, her carefully constructed kingdom of beige houses and petty rules, had just been systematically dismantled in front of her entire court. They let her out, sputtering and crying about her husband's lawyers. The room was left in stunned silence. I packed up my projector, my laptop, and my logbook. Project Nightingale was complete. The aftermath was swift and total. Brenda and her husband were charged with embezzlement, fraud, and a half-dozen other things. They lost everything. Their assets were seized to pay back the HOA and a mountain of fines. Their house was sold at auction. The last I heard, she was serving a 4-year sentence in a low-security federal prison. The HOA was in shambles. The remaining board members, the hostages, resigned en masse. A new emergency board was formed, led by my neighbor George. Their first official act was to vote unanimously to issue a formal apology to me. Their second was to approve the immediate and permanent removal of the Creekwood Nature Trail. Their third was to approve a significant financial settlement to me for damages to my property and for the legal harassment I had endured. The pigs stayed for another month. They became local celebrities. People would come by just to see the 40 hogs of justice. I eventually sold them back to Stu at a profit and donated the money to a local 4-H club to start a scholarship program. With the settlement money from the HOA, I did 2 things. First, I had my pasture professionally restored. The scar is gone now. It's just green grass and wildflowers again. Second, I hired a law firm to establish a non-profit foundation. I called it the Eleanor Project. It provides pro bono legal advice and assistance to ordinary people who are being bullied by corrupt and overreaching HOAs. My life is quiet again. The only sounds are the wind in the old oaks and the birds that Eleanor loved so much. I have my sanctuary back. It turns out, the best way to deal with a complex problem isn't to shout at it. It's to analyze it, find its critical failure point, and apply precise, overwhelming force. Brenda Collins thought she was fighting a stubborn old man over a garden path. She never realized she was in a logistics war with a supply chain expert. And in a logistics war, the person who controls the flow of information, who understands the system better than their opponent, always wins. Always.